For 74 years, between 1915 and March 1st, 1989, the Icelandic government had a prohibition against the sale or consumption of beer on the island. This is part of a series of prohibitions on alcohol that were enacted across several Western countries during the early 1900s. This includes Norway, Finland, and most notably the United States. And as noted by Professor Helgi Gunnlaugsson of the University of Iceland in the US, Prohibition was largely framed as part of a larger cultural conflict between rural Protestant Americans and Catholic and Jewish immigrants in the cities, with many American supporters of Prohibition often using caricatures to depict these new immigrants as being alcoholics and criminals. But unlike the US, Iceland did not experience a large wave of immigration in relation to the issue of Prohibition. Instead, a lot of the issues surrounding the banning of beer can be uncovered by looking at the conflicts between the four major Icelandic political parties, as well as a growing divide that emerged between the cities and the countryside, as many Icelanders began moving into large urban centers during the 20th century, with the question on whether to ban beer beginning with an island-wide vote in 1908. Now during this time, only men over the age of 25 could vote, with 2/3 of these male voters going on to support Prohibition. And as Iceland is located very close to the Arctic Circle, the cold climate made it very difficult to grow the grapes, corn, or barley needed to locally produce alcohol. As a result of this, a lot of the alcohol on the island had to be imported from Europe. Therefore, in order to begin Prohibition, all foreign imports of alcohol were banned after 1912, and a full ban on the local sale of alcohol began in 1915. However, as soon as Icelandic Prohibition began, it just as quickly started to unravel. Just 2 years later, in 1917, a law was passed allowing for alcohol to be sold for medical purposes. Then 5 years later, in 1922, the Spanish government, unhappy that Iceland was no longer importing Spanish wines, said that they would no longer import any Icelandic fish. And since fish are a major export of Iceland, this resulted in Spanish wines being allowed to be imported into the country. Finally, in 1933, another referendum was held on the issue of Prohibition. Now by this time, women were allowed to vote, and the voting age had also been lowered to 21. With almost 2/3 of voters now choosing to end Prohibition. However, while the ban on most alcoholic drinks was lifted in 1935, the Icelandic government continued to ban beer that had more than 2.25% alcohol for the next 54 years, with the four major Icelandic political parties at the time largely being divided 3-1 on the issue of the beer ban. Now, for a great deal of the 20th century, Iceland had a four-party system, made up of the Independents, Progressive, Social Democratic, and Socialist parties, with the Socialist Party eventually becoming the People's Alliance later on. These parties were first founded in the early 1900s in order to represent the interests of different sectors of Icelandic society. The Progressive Party is the oldest and was founded in 1916 to represent the interests of farmers, as during this time, at least 70% of the island still lived and worked in the countryside. In the cities, two left-wing parties, the Social Democrats and the Socialists, emerged to support the interests of union workers and manual laborers, with the Social Democrats modeling themselves on other democratic labor parties found in Scandinavia, while the Socialist Party, which had emerged from the Icelandic Communist Party, aligned themselves more with the increasingly authoritarian Soviet Union. And in response to the rise of these two left-wing parties, the two major parties on the right, the Liberals and the Conservatives, decided to work together to form the Independence Party, with the name of the party emphasizing the nationalist desire for Iceland to become an independent country. This because, for the first half of the 20th century, Iceland was still a kingdom in a personal union with Denmark, with King Christian X of Denmark also being the first king of Iceland. Now, the base of the Independence Party were largely the middle classes, but as they were also the most prominent pro-capitalist and business-friendly party, they were able to gain widespread support across the entire country in many sectors of society. For example, in the countryside and along the coast, the Independence Party competed against the Progressive Party for the votes of the local farmers and fishermen, while in the cities, they competed against the two left-wing parties for the support of the working classes, with manual laborers and blue-collar workers largely voting for Social Democrats or Socialists, while more white-collar workers supported the Independence Party. Interestingly, the Independence Party was also able to gain the support of a large amount of women, including working-class women. Due to this, of the first two women ever elected to the Althingi, the Icelandic parliament, both ended up being members of the Independence Party. And due to this widespread support, the Independence Party started to depict itself as the party of unity, representing the interests of the nation as a whole, in contrast to the other parties, who were seen as only representing the interests of one sector of society. And throughout the 20th century, as a result of this popularity, the Independence Party ended up getting the largest share of votes during election time, usually in the range of 30 to 40%, with the Progressive Party coming in second place with 20 to 30%, while the two left-wing parties usually came in third and fourth place, with around 15% each. This meant that, as the largest party in parliament, every single leader of the Independence Party has eventually gone on to become Prime Minister of Iceland. But at the same time, since no party has ever gotten a majority of the votes, alliances between the different parties are also very common, with there usually being an alliance between the Independents and the Progressives, or between the Independents and the Social Democrats. As a result, even though the Independence Party was the largest right-wing force in Icelandic politics, due to the need to form coalitions, as well as the fact that they were supported by a diverse range of people from different backgrounds, the party itself wasn't that ideologically conservative, with the party soon coming to accept the Icelandic welfare state, as well as several other progressive social policies. However, as a result of accepting these more liberal policies, conservative factions of the party have broken off over the years and established rival parties on the right. Now, there would occasionally be a fifth party elected to parliament, such as the Women's List, which sought to increase awareness of women's issues and get more women elected to the Icelandic parliament. However, they eventually ended up merging with several other left-wing parties to form the Social Democratic Alliance. There's also the Liberal Party of the 1990s, who are mainly interested in issues related to the fishing industry. However, after nearly a decade in parliament, they failed to get enough support to be re-elected. In relation to the ban on beer, the Progressives, Social Democrats, and Socialists largely supported the ban. This is because these three parties saw beer as a great social threat to Icelandic society, especially children, with there being a widespread belief that as a relatively cheap drink, beer will become a gateway drug that could lead the working classes and children to become alcoholics. On the other hand, the Independence Party was the only major party to consistently oppose the beer ban, with there being at least 20 attempts to legalize beer between 1935 and 1989. This is because they saw the ban as a nonsensical limitation on the freedom of Icelanders to drink beer, and for businesses to make and sell beer. Especially as much stronger alcoholic drinks, such as wine and vodka, were already legal, so it didn't seem to make much sense to only ban beer, as it was one of the weakest alcoholic drinks. With the party also criticizing the economics of the beer ban, as it prevented a local brewing industry from developing on the island. Now, during the mid-1900s, Iceland went through a great series of changes. After several decades of being in a personal union with Denmark, a referendum was held where almost all Icelanders voted to abolish the union and write a new Icelandic constitution. As a result, Iceland finally became an independent republic on June 17, 1944, a little more than a year before the end of World War II. Making King Kristjánsson X the first and last king of Iceland. And after independence, as the country began to become more urbanized, the tensions between the cities and the countryside only increased, with there being a clear urban versus rural divide on the beer ban, leading there to be competing factions in almost every political party on the issue, with the rural politicians supporting the ban on beer, while the more urban members supported legalization. For example, although the largely urban Independence Party wanted to legalize beer, the more rural members of the party supported the beer ban. And while the Social Democratic Party largely supported the beer ban, the more urban members of the party wanted to legalize it. Now, this might seem odd for a largely urban left-wing party like the Social Democrats or the Socialists to support the beer ban, given their voter base not being in the countryside. However, as a result of the migration of workers into the cities, during this time, almost all political parties were divided between those members who were raised in the cities and those who had recently moved into them, with there being many members of these parties who were once rural farm workers and fishermen that had come to the cities in order to find work. And as a result of this, they had also brought with them their rural dislike for drinking beer, with the countryside having this strong anti-beer stance due to the popularity of the Christian temperance movement and Icelandic nationalism, which painted beer as a foreign drink brought by the Danish. This was despite the fact that records of drinking in Icelandic sagas go back several hundred years. This continued migration into the cities led almost 90% of the island to entirely live in urban areas by the 1980s, with more than half of the population of Iceland living in or around the capital city of Reykjavik. And as this urban population grew, so did the support for legalizing beer, with Icelandic people finding creative loopholes to get their hands on beer. Home brewing became much more common, Icelandic tourists started bringing back foreign beers from vacations in Europe and America, and some local bars in Reykjavik even started to serve beer likes, which was a mixed drink made to mimic the taste of beer, without legally being beer. This would be done by taking a non-alcoholic beer and mixing it with vodka or wine in order to add alcohol, with it reportedly tasting awful. Now, as a result of this pressure and change of social attitudes, beer would eventually become legalized on March 1st, 1989, 74 years after it was first banned in 1915, with this becoming known as Beer Day in Iceland. And in the decades after it was legalized, beer overtook vodka and wine to become one of the most common alcoholic drinks in Iceland, with it soon accounting for more than half of all alcohol consumed on the island. And while there are fears that children will be more likely to drink as a result of beer becoming legal, youth drinking had actually decreased a lot over the past 30 years since legalization, with Iceland actually having the lowest youth drinking rate in all of Europe, with this largely being the result of local schools, parents, and governments working to fund more after-school programs, encouraging parents to spend more time with their families, and enforcing strict curfews in order to prevent children from coming in contact with alcohol. The sale of alcohol is also strictly controlled, with people only being able to buy it from bars, breweries, or state-run shops. The government also enacted a strict ban on advertising alcohol in order to make it much less appealing to the general public. Alcohol is also much more expensive in Iceland relative to other Western countries, making it very costly for the general public, let alone a child, to be able to afford a drink. Now, in the 21st century, the Icelandic political landscape has become much more fragmented, with many people attributing these changes to the emergence of new political movements as a result of the 2008 Icelandic financial crisis, with this crisis being one small part of the much larger global Great Recession. During this time, Iceland experienced one of the biggest banking failures in human history, when 97% of their financial sector failed and their three largest banks collapsed, leading inflation to skyrocket, and for Iceland to fall into the worst recession since the Second World War. As a result, there were a series of protests known as the Pots and Pans Revolution, with the crisis leading many people to become increasingly distrustful of established political parties and institutions, who they blame for either causing the catastrophe or not doing enough to prevent it from happening. As a result, many political parties emerged in the coming years to challenge the establishment, but only a couple of them would end up lasting for more than a few elections. Now, before the financial crisis, about 90% of voters supported one of the parties from the old four-party system. But as they started to lose support, newer parties started to become more popular. This led there to be 8 parties elected to parliament during the 2021 elections. This includes the older parties, such as the Independents and Progressives, along with 6 other political parties, with the Social Democratic and Socialist/People's Alliance parties having merged with other political movements to form the Social Democratic Alliance and the Left Greens back in the 1990s. With these 4 parties representing the classical 4-party system that existed before, while the People's, Reform, Center, and Pirate parties were all founded in the 2010s to represent new popular political movements that emerged after the financial crisis. And although these newer parties are very distinct from one another, they're all united by the fact that they tap into different strains of Icelandic populism. The People's Party was founded by Inga Sealand, an older woman with a visual disability, with the main goal of the party being for them to advocate for disabled people, the elderly, as well as fighting poverty, especially childhood poverty. Along with increased social welfare programs, the party has also been associated with Icelandic nationalism, where they have expressed the need for the government to prioritize the interests of Icelanders first. This is seen as part of a reaction against the recent increase of immigrants and asylum seekers to the country. For example, in the 1990s, only 2% of the population were immigrants or foreigners, with that number now being closer to 18% as of 2023, with the single largest ethnic minority in the country being the Polish, who started coming to Iceland to work manual labor jobs. The Liberal Reform Party brands itself as a party of freedom. This is because they are seen as being very socially progressive, as they want to protect individual rights and freedoms, while also being very capitalist, due to their support of free trade and free markets. They also want Iceland to build closer international relationships with other countries, with one major goal of the party being for Iceland to eventually join the European Union. The Center Party is largely built around its controversial founder, Sigmundur Gunnlaugsson, who was once the leader of the Progressive Party, and even became Prime Minister of Iceland in 2013. But then the Panama Papers scandal occurred. This was a large leak of documents that showed that many rich and powerful people from around the world were hiding huge amounts of money so they didn't have to pay taxes on it, with it being discovered that Gunnlaugsson and his wife were hiding millions of dollars in offshore accounts, leading to a series of protests that eventually resulted in him resigning as Prime Minister in 2016. But despite all this, he managed to re-enter politics as the leader of the newly founded Center Party in 2017, with the Center Party challenging the political establishment from the right by emphasizing the need to have stricter borders and immigration controls, as well as lowering government spending and cutting taxes in order to help Icelandic citizens and local businesses. The Pirate Party of Iceland is part of the international pirate political movement, with there being several local versions of the party across Europe and America, with the Icelandic Pirate Party focusing on the need for there to be more government transparency in order to prevent corruption. They also want to challenge the established copyright and intellectual property laws, due to the internet making it much easier to share information, with the party being very popular with younger college-educated voters. Now, for the past 12 years, the Independence Party has largely remained the most prominent force in politics, with the party forming a coalition in 2017 with the Progressives and the Left-Green Alliance in order to run the country, with this being known as the Left-Right-Center Coalition, as each of the parties came from different parts of the political spectrum. And despite concerns that this alliance would quickly collapse due to political differences, it managed to last for 7 years until 2024, with the 2024 election resulting in a series of changes to the Icelandic political landscape. Most notably, the Social Democrats displaced the Independents as the largest political party in parliament for the second time in its history, with the first time being in 2009, during the financial crisis. However, when looking at the results, despite becoming the largest party, the Social Democrats only got about 20% of the vote. Compared to the traditional 4-party system, there's only a little more than the usual 15% the older Social Democratic Party would get, and much less than the 30 to 40% the Independence Party had gotten when they were the largest party in parliament. With these results showing how political support has shifted to new political parties over the years. In addition to this, the largest gains were felt by the Liberal Reform, People's, and Centre parties, while the Pirate Party and the Left Greens ended up being wiped out after they lost all their seats. This was quite surprising, especially as the former leader of the Left Greens, Katrin Jakobsdóttir, had been one of the most popular prime ministers in recent Icelandic history. And even though the Progressives lost more than half of their representatives, they managed to remain in parliament. Now, one reason for this is that rural areas where the Progressive Party has a lot of support are overrepresented in the Althingi. For example, while almost 2/3 of the country live in or around the capital of Reykjavik, and the remaining 1/3 of the people live in the countryside, the electoral system allows for each region to elect almost half of the Icelandic parliament, meaning that urban areas end up underrepresented, and rural areas end up being overrepresented. And then in December, a new government emerged, with this being an alliance between the Social Democrats, Liberal Reform, and People's parties. With this alliance also being notable, as it's the first time that each of the coalition parties have been led by women. It is also one of the few times where the Independence Party has been left out of the ruling coalition. And although the number of parties in the Icelandic parliament has been reduced to 6, the results of the last election show a political landscape that is much more fragmented than it once was, when there are only 4 major political parties. But as recent elections have shown, this also allows for new opportunities for parties from across the political spectrum to come together and help govern the Icelandic people. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks to my patrons Untroid and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.